Okay, well, it looks like we're leveling out with our participants, so we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us for what is a critical topic here this Congress. The webinar today will be focusing on the pathway to the surface transportation reauthorization and what are the important things for us to know. One, about how the reauthorization process really works. Two, how to sort of ensure that your priorities as a company or an industry aren't overlooked in that process. And three, how Boundary Stone can help give you a strategic advantage as we enter into this season where we will have lots and lots of hearings and topics to dig through. And you'll definitely need some assistance in figuring out what matters and what's just noise. Moving on, I'd love to kind of introduce a little bit of our folks here on the panel today. We have a lot of expertise, both from agencies and from Congress represented on the panel. I'll start with my colleague, Andrew Rogers, who is a senior VP here at Boundary Stone. He is a former executive and chief counsel and a former chief counsel at the U.S. Senate EPW committee. He considers himself a principal architect of the IIJA, which is like a really big deal here in this world. So we always appreciate having some experts who know what the real congressional intent was when we're writing stuff here. Moving on to Andrew Wishnia. We like Andrews on this team. He's also a senior vice president here at Boundary Stone Partners. He was the deputy assistant secretary for climate policy at USDOT, a lead transportation staffer also at Senate EPW, and another also engaged as a principal architect in that IIJA discussion, but has been on both sides of this issue. So we've had folks who have been at DOT and at EPW. I'll then go on to Pete Gould, who's also here at Boundary Stone Partners, who was a senior staffer on House T&I, serving in the Highways and Transit team, had considerable time working in the House and led transportation policy at Uber before he came here to Boundary Stone Partners. And then for myself, I'm Emily Domenech, been at BSP for about the last year and previously served as a senior policy advisor for the last two speakers of the House, Mike Johnson and Kevin McCarthy. So I have lived through a surface transportation bill from the Speaker's office and been engaged in a lot of the sort of bipartisan policymaking that goes into these big bills that require that sort of 60 vote threshold to get done and require some cooperation between Republicans and Democrats. We're very deep in the season of reconciliation right now. So people are very focused on those partisan politics, but the reality is we're still doing the groundwork for these bipartisan bills that we see further out in the Congress. So let's move on a little bit to sort of what's at stake as we look forward on the agenda for the surface transportation bill. I want to sort of kick it to Andrew Wishnia first to talk a little bit about what's happening with the reauthorization. Walk us through how this process works. How does the surface transportation reauthorization come together? Why is it important, and sort of what's going on right now that we can be thinking about that sort of is laying the groundwork for this bill that's going to be coming up next year?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Emily, thanks so much for your leadership. And, Pete and Andrew have a ton of leadership and expertise on this topic. So I'm really excited for this webinar. So just to start with the nomenclature, a reauthorization is shorthand for the need to reauthorize literally dozens of authorities, including, expenditure authority pertaining to the Highway Trust Fund, extensions for the various excise taxes that comprise the Highway Trust Fund, and funding for a variety of transportation programs over a multi-year duration. So these are big deals. And to make this accessible to everyone tuning in, and to understand how these bills come together, it might just be helpful to understand what's in it. So, if you were looking at a table of contents for a surface transportation reauthorization, and you were thinking of a transportation bill as a chapter book, you would see chapters on highways, transportation research, freight transportation, and additional chapters on rail, transit, motor carriers, and hazardous materials, because these are multimodal transportation bills. And this just reflects the fact that, we have not only a transportation system, but a system of systems that oftentimes rely on each other and as a result need to be thought of together. We should also mention that one of the many things that make transportation bills unique is a large chunk of funding is appropriated through the reauthorization process. And that funding, primarily out of what is called the Highway Trust Fund, is effectively lockboxed, which makes transportation bills durable and secure regardless of political tailwinds. And according to Secretary Duffy's testimony today, that will continue to be true going forward. So you'll also see subchapters on things like permitting, transportation planning, and performance management. Historically, transportation bills don't get done without permitting provisions, and the bipartisan infrastructure law was no exception, including a title. Emily, I think you've talked about this numerous times on permitting called One Federal Decision. A couple of other things to note are that the bipartisan infrastructure law included the first ever climate title. And just to note from a historical reference point, that title and of course, bill was largely negotiated under the first Trump administration with a Republican chair in the Senate, and additional titles were folded into the bipartisan infrastructure law because the bill became an infrastructure bill versus only a surface transportation bill. So there is a bit of inoculation that we can talk about later, from the current political moment when transportation and infrastructure staffers are entrusted to build one of these bills. And in terms of how a bill comes together, the infrastructure bill of 2021 had its roots in a surface transportation bill, which were several of the chapters listed earlier, which was the base or first bill that was approved by a congressional committee that had jurisdiction over particular aspects of our transportation system. And over time, other committees either move forward with what is jurisdictional for them, either through what's called regular order, meaning they have a formal process for passage within their committee, or through discussions with congressional leadership. Typically, what happens is the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House and Committee on Environment and Public Works in the Senate are the first committees to begin work on programs and funding in their respective jurisdiction, and given deadlines in law, as well as political pressure, frankly, eventually work with a variety of other committees of jurisdiction, and depending on administration, the White House as well, to produce component parts that staff negotiate amongst interest groups and members of Congress that sit on their respective committees of jurisdiction.
Yeah, so Andrew, I know you've been involved in shaping these past reauthorization bills, and I actually have had a few conversations with Chairman Graves' team and how they really want to emphasize that member-driven approach that they leaned into last Congress on the FAA bill and on the WRDA bill as sort of the model for how they assemble this surface transportation bill this time around. Can you give folks here who tuned in today a little bit of a background on like what's happening now? What are the steps that are being put that committees are going through to make sure they have this bill well organized and ready to move forward on time?
Yeah, and I know you have a ton of experience coming from the leadership office.
More than I would like, for sure. If you're a leadership person, you were hoping the committee does its work so you don't have to.
I think that's what all staff say. And, Andrew and Pete were directly involved and have unmatched expertise. I think just from my vantage point, to understand where we go from here, we need to know, sort of where we've been. And where we've been is that, the bipartisan infrastructure law changed the definitional approach of what constitutes transportation infrastructure, full stop. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that we're not going to be, authorizing programs for roads, highways, and bridges. We absolutely will be, now and forevermore. But never before did we have a federal definition for things like transportation resilience or natural infrastructure or funding, eligibility for wildlife crossings, or EV charging, other alternative fueling infrastructure, or broadband, or eligibility for transmission in the right of way, or transportation projects functionally connected to water infrastructure projects. I could go on and I'm tempted to, but that's a massive policy impact that is not going away in future authorizations. And that's the baseline of sort of how we define infrastructure in our country going forward, which means there are new opportunities for many of you listening in to have your voice heard. We also saw the convergence of economic sectors like transportation and energy reflected in federal legislation, which is why there are now offices to promote efficiencies and working together on problems which cross silos like the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, and more broadly, partnerships and de-siloing the federal government to make it more responsive to solve transportation challenges is a touchstone of the legislation. With respect to what's happening now, several gates of the reauthorization process began this week. So this is a really opportune time to be having this conversation. In the Senate, as I mentioned just today, this morning, Secretary Duffy kicked off the Senate's reauthorization process by noting his emphasis on safety, innovation, and project delivery. And as mentioned previously, EPW has committed to move a bill forward this year. So, I would say to the, folks tuning in, Emily, if you have priorities in that committee's jurisdiction, you must articulate them this year for consideration. Other committees in the Senate, including Commerce, Banking, Appropriations, will also be involved with EPW, and Leader Schumer's office on strategy for sort of defining the parameters for a bill. And questions in early negotiations and alignment from within respective caucuses are happening right now. And they'll include questions like whether they want to do a surface bill or an infrastructure bill. What are their top priorities as a caucus? What is their red line? Is each party okay with building on the last bill, or do they want to see structural, programmatic, or funding reforms? Again, those discussions are happening right now. And, I think our sense is having your voice heard matters. So I guess I can't make this point strongly enough. Two common misconceptions are that it doesn't really matter about articulating your priorities until Congress needs to act on a reauthorization, meaning, just months prior to reauthorization, and that the political moment of today is tethered to the negotiations. No and no. Our team conceived, wrote, and negotiated dozens and dozens of provisions, multi-billion-dollar provisions that, Andrew and Pete can tell you more about, economic sector changing provisions that impact folks who are listening in without any advocacy from the outside or our dais when we were on the inside, because folks were, either misinformed on the gating processes for a transportation reauthorization bill, or, just a misread of the politics of now versus the politics of what it takes to get a transportation bill done. On both, I guess suffice to say, there's ample opportunity if you understand who, when, what, and how to leverage your policy preferences for maximum impact.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think there's been a real trend, particularly in the House, towards these sort of open-facing dialogues with industry in the months leading up to a bill. We saw it last year with Ways and Means, where they opened up a bunch of portals to take feedback from industry groups going into reconciliation and the tax reauth bill. And I can tell you firsthand that from discussions with those folks, if people didn't file, like they didn't submit comments or didn't submit letters, it was an easy way for folks to say, hey, you didn't care enough to weigh in with us. This must not be that important of an issue. So I suspect we'll see that same approach again particularly from House T&I, to sort of say, hey, we really want to get your feedback, and we want to get it not just from industry, but from members who care about this kind of stuff too. We'll see member portals open and that sort of thing as well. So I want to shift to Pete to talk a little bit about sort of how the funding decisions actually get made. What's the balance when we look at sort of the last bill going forward to the first bill? I've heard from Chairman Graves' team that they really want to sort of refocus those investments on the core part of this legislation, that core infrastructure in the surface transportation bill. So how do you think this will play out, and what are sort of the big policy shifts you see happening from the IIJA to this next surface reauth?
Perfect. Yeah, no, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Andrew. It's a big question. I think one is that question of what is infrastructure. I think that is still to be determined. And I think a lot of that comes down to that advocacy from, again, bipartisan advocacy to have those stakeholders in it. But, speaking to what are we seeing in terms of the kind of broader themes that are emerging here and where the policy priorities are going to go. I think obviously a lot has changed since the time period when the IIJA was passed and signed into law. And those changes not only at the kind of political power dynamics, but also kind of broader macro events and trends. Those are important factors that weigh onto the process, what's the art of the possible, and then the eventual final product of any reauthorization. Obviously, we are looking at kind of a wholesale change of power from, again, when the bill was signed and passed. We had a kind of Democratic trifecta, and now we are looking at a Republican trifecta. But if you look back, as I think Andrew mentioned here, this process for IIJA actually did begin under the first Trump administration, with Republicans in the Senate taking the lead. And under the, I guess we'll call it under Trump 1, the president had campaigned, if you remember, on $1 trillion infrastructure bill. It's big. He's a builder. He wants to build big things. And while the bill itself and kind of Infrastructure Week, which became kind of a joke, but if that had not been there, it really did influence, I think, the negotiations and drafting and conversations that we were seeing at EPW about going bigger and bolder, and as a result, bringing on, to bring on Democrats, that brought on things like a climate title. And so where we are, the Biden administration then taking over, passed IIJA and IRA and really made those large federal investments and bills, particularly in all things infrastructure, that kind of centerpiece of what was to be the legacy. And I think what we are going to see here, though, is as a result, that was less of an emphasis on, of the Trump campaign now, of trying to, run on infrastructure, because it just was less of kind of because they haven't done it, we're going to do it. And so we don't have that dynamic at the, as being one of those top priorities coming in this time. Another kind of broader macro theme that we are seeing in the second Trump administration right now that could impact the process is the administration and Congress's push to reduce spending, and you have the kind of DOGE efforts to reduce spending even at the contract level, and the administration has absolutely prioritized deregulatory solutions over really leaning into increased spending as a pathway for kind of accomplishment and growth. So I'd say those are kind of what we are seeing still emerge, at least particularly at the administration level. And then, that being said, there are definitely kind of a number of specific policy clear themes that are emerging and that are going to shape this process, and then ultimately that end goal. And I'd say first and foremost is safety. The refrain, safety, is the department's #1 priority. Everyone who has ever worked at DOT or worked with them has heard this refrain over and over again. But with the second Trump administration right now, within days of Secretary Duffy taking office, we've had a series of high-profile catastrophes of transportation safety, in particular the very high-profile and tragic plane crash in the Potomac here at DCA, where we lost 67 lives. And from basically out the gate, it is already kind of re-emphasized and reprioritized from a visibility and messaging, how key safety is. And I think this is something that Secretary Duffy has continued to hark back on and is going to be a real key theme. And we've heard today as well from Chair Capito that first priority and theme for going into this is going to be safety. But I also would say this extends to the deployment of new innovation and safety technology, which the Secretary has spoken about at length, and that we've seen, again, there was no AI title in IIJA because there was not really AI at the time, and so we are seeing a lot more tools that can be used by state DOTs and by cities to really address safety, and I think that's going to be an increasing area of importance here. The second area and theme that we are seeing is kind of this question between the flexibility of funding, and typically in formula, versus specificity and discretionary grant programs. So the approach that was taken in IIJA was to really target a number of very important issues and challenges that are very specific, and to do so by creating very specific programs and funding pots to address each. This can be seen in the many new discretionary, but also some formula programs that were created that, rather than here's an issue, highlighting it, and just having within the big broad buckets of formula funds that can cover everything, really trying to say, no, we want you to invest in this to accomplish, to address this specific project. What we've heard as a result here, kind of strong and often bipartisan support for probably consolidating this. There were a lot of new grant programs. There were just a lot of grant programs in general. Each one of those requires a NOFO, requires, projects to be ready, creation of an application. And it became a lot, both up for the applicants as well as for the agencies. And so I think we're going to see a strong effort to, at one, consolidate, but also to kind of not use that necessarily that same approach of specific problem, create new specific program to address it. But that there are going to be opportunities to address problems within broader programs. And, it's going to be a question of, it's not that there won't be any discretionary grant programs in this bill or after this bill, but there will be significantly fewer. And so, I think a big part of the process and advocating and the negotiations is going to be what survives and what is consolidated into what, and then obviously the program funding levels. So that I think is one area that we want that we're definitely taking a look at. And then third, project delays and permitting. I think we all know that everything takes much longer than anyone would like it to when you're building infrastructure with federal dollars. Congress has come close to passing permitting reform last Congress. I know Emily was very engaged on that and continues to be. It continues to be a discussion this Congress and until we address it. And this is beyond transportation; it's on all things. Secretary Duffy leaned into this issue extensively today in the Senate EPW hearing, really talking about not just from the standpoint of we're not just talking NEPA and broad permitting. We're talking all the way at the process internally and interagency. The process to get from an announced award to a grant agreement. That we've got to be able to do all of this faster and more efficiently. And so I think, as the secretary and others have noted, kind of over the decades, there's been a kind of an accumulation of processes, rules, and other guardrails, each of which has a very important basis and intent, but when all layered on top of each other, is increasingly creating a situation where it is a lot easier to stop projects than to do projects. And so that being said, everyone loves permitting reform for the projects they love and not for the projects they don't. And this issue, again, is not from lack of interest and effort that it has not been solved. So again, this will be an area that will, and I would say has to be addressed as we go forward to be able to actually deliver on the intents of these programs. The fourth area that I want to talk about too is on potential policy headwinds. In particular, issues and programs that are centered around climate, equity, even transit more broadly. Have been hotly debated before and during IIJA implementation years. But the programs and stuff with these specific limitations and that are named specifically at them, those are ones that I think have become kind of have faced heightened scrutiny, particularly from the majorities in the House and Senate now, and this as well as the administration. That doesn't mean that this bill is not going to be providing funding and programs that can address equity, climate, and obviously public transportation. But I would say, particularly on the first two, it is increasingly going to be less, by name, this program is about equity. And so finding areas and ways to achieve outcomes rather than kind of the very clear intents of programs to be lined out. But we've seen this with electric vehicles as well. This has become a increasing political kind of punching bag and lightning rod. We've seen it in the tax credit debates, and we've been hearing about it with NEVI and others. And so these are areas where, again, that doesn't mean that there is not going to be anything in here. We have seen that this is where the advocacy part is so important. all the way from the projects and the programs for that go down to the local level that happen in red and blue states, as well as the manufacturing and the supply chains that go into them. So that again, I think that's an area that we really want to highlight, that you're going to need a big broad coalition. You're going to need bipartisanship, and that is going to take thinking outside the box, and also not just expecting that somebody is going to feel one way or another, because you can, with the right effort and research, find your allies. And then the fifth area, which again this is a ubiquitous one. This is the question between rural and urban area focuses. The Senate was designed to ensure that big cities and high population states weren't able to just ignore the needs of smaller states and rural areas. And this dynamic is always on display in surface transportation reauthorization. With Republican control of both chambers and the White House, that means that any policy program that you're proposing and that you're advocating for is going to have to be able to answer the question, how does this benefit and serve rural communities? So I think that's, again, just something that's very important to take for. And we saw Senate DPW Chair Capito and Secretary Duffy both highlight that importance today in the hearing. And then lastly, the other fun recurring theme here is Highway Trust Fund insolvency. So, the IIJA required a transfer from the general fund of $118 billion into the Highway Trust Fund to cover the cost of this bill. In fact, roughly 40% of all federal aid highway projects were funded not by the gas taxes or other user fees that we always think of, but by general funds. And so in an era of kind of aversion to mounting deficits and debts, there comes a point where the transportation community is not going to be able to depend on such large kind of transfers and bailouts forever, especially as these numbers mount. I think when I was on the Hill, we needed the first transfer and it was $8 billion. 118 is a very different ballgame. And so as these increase, that becomes unsustainable. And I think this, like a lot of any other issue that has been going on for a while and been punted for, that can and have been punted for decades, the real question does become political will, as well as finding solutions that both work from a political will standpoint, but also operational. So that's I think the other big question. We're already hearing, there's a growing drumbeat for EVs to pay in. But again, unless you are doing an annual fee of $1 million per EV, and even then, I don't know how close we are to filling this hole. So this is a lot more than just EVs, and a holistic approach really does need to be taken. So those, I'd say, are the big themes that we're seeing, Emily.
Yeah, so Pete, you gave us a lot to think about and cover there. I will just echo, I think this theme of making sure the EVs pay their fair share for the Highway Trust Fund is something that I would absolutely expect to see from Republicans. But I do think there's an acknowledgement that certainly doesn't come anywhere close to filling the gap that we have looking at the funding needs that we have going forward. Before I pivot to Andrew Rogers, I just want to encourage our participants. We are going to open this up for Q&A. So if you'd like to drop your questions through the Q&A function, we'll try to get to them when we get near the end of the webinar. So feel free to ask away for any of our panelists. Andrew, I just, obviously we've covered a lot about how these funding priorities are sort of shifting around and where there's opportunity as we look forward to this reauthorization. But, we know that frankly, it's far more difficult to get something actually implemented in the department than just, starting with your idea in a legislative text. You've got to be able to really carry it all the way through the implementation. From your experience, what does it take to kind of start from scratch with a policy idea here? And what are the kinds of steps we should be taking to influence, particularly the sort of 6 areas that Pete covered in his rundown?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today. We're trying to get a little bit smarter about a very wonky and very complicated process, but a process that ultimately leads to a piece of legislation that I would dare to say everyone on this phone or everyone on this call uses every single day, going A to B, getting people in places and things safely. That is really the core of what transportation is about. And so we may talk about pet policies and programs. At the end of the day, we're just trying to do it better and more safely. As Pete just laid out rather robustly, the political and policy landscape is certainly shifted since IIJA was originally envisioned and has continued to shift even as it's been implemented. And those shifts are going to absolutely shape the next reauthorization, but there's also macro forces sort of around the construction of the bill that is going to have a similar effect. There's one thing that hasn't changed, though, and Andrew touched on this earlier. If you want to influence policy, you cannot wait until the bill is drafted. You must engage before the public-facing legislative process has begun. If your strategy is an amendment strategy, it is not a strategy. I sort of tease my former House colleagues where they actually do markups with live legislation and consider amendments and actually change bills. In the Senate, it's a bit more of a rehearsal.
The Senate likes to script things. It's okay. We play it a little faster and looser in the House.
It's a good thing. What that means is, know your audience, but also know your actors. And if you're waiting for, the 11th hour before a deadline, or you're procrastinating like I used to do in college for that committee report, it's too late. And particularly if you're looking for, significant changes or new programs or new funding levels, if you have not socialized those ideas early and often, they will be left on the cutting room floor. The other thing I'll say is the organizations that are most effective in shaping policy, they don't just react to what Congress puts forward. They're actively working with lawmakers and committee staff and agency leaders, and this is a key one, who provide the technical assistance, this is a dirty little secret, that then inform committee staff as to what to actually put into the bill. Because at the end of the day, it's the agencies that are implementing the rules that Congress writes for them. And if the agency doesn't understand the instruction, well, then Congress hasn't done a very good job. And so there's absolutely an important game of telephone that happens there to ensure that the laws Congress is writing are understood and can actually be interpreted as intended by the agencies. But the other part of it is you need to educate policymakers. This isn't just advocacy. A lot of it is education, providing data, helping to shape that initial framework. And again, if you wait until a bill is introduced, you're hoping you're in it. You're playing catch up. And this is especially true now as policymakers. And this is what Pete was alluding to, are reconsidering past approaches. We believe they're looking at formalizing or consolidating discretionary programs, addressing project delivery delays through permitting reform, but also interagency process reforms, and really, really emphasizing innovation, as we've heard Secretary Duffy do. Nearly every time I've heard him speak publicly, he has made some reference to really embracing new technologies and innovation for a whole host of outcomes. So if an organization wants to ensure its priorities, fit into these evolving discussions, it absolutely needs to be in the room early, but it also needs to make sure that it finds a home in one of those core areas. You're on mute, Emily.
Sorry, I knew I was going to do that eventually. Thinking ahead, I think how we talk a lot about collaboration and stakeholder engagement, and sort of how do we get these two things to work together? What does that mean in practice, like in practical terms? How are we getting people in front of members? How do you make a member your advocate? What's the kind of process that you would take someone through in that space?
Yeah. I think the first thing is get crystal clear before the meeting, before the fly-in, before the outreach. What are you actually trying to accomplish? Going to a member office or going to a committee staff office and just saying, I want more money for, bike lanes. Great. What does that mean? What are you solving for? What is the specific use case that you're trying to address here? If you have those answers considered and you've got, dare I say, even draft legislative text to start, a member down the road, you're a leg up on the competition because you've actually thought what it would mean and you've made their jobs easier. But the other piece of this is that, I started to talk about this earlier, it's committee staff, it's member offices, it's the agency experts. It's also talking to aligned industry and advocacy groups. Don't go alone. If you're trying to have these conversations in a vacuum, or you're trying to have the conversation, despite your competitive interests somewhere else, you're going to be far less likely to be successful. The House still engages in a bit of an earmarky process. The Senate does not. If you're an industry member and you're saying the way we're going to solve for, congestion in Houston is, my widget, that's great. But unless there's a whole bunch of people that make your widget across the country that all the members can benefit from, it's probably not going to be a very long conversation with that member office. And so don't go alone if you want to go far. The other side of that coin is engage your opponents. Who is going to not like your idea and have responses to their criticisms or their objections ready at hand when you engage those member offices. Think about why, despite their valid criticisms, that nevertheless, a member or committee office should stick their neck out and, put forward a proposal that, may cost, as Andrew and Pete were saying, literally hundreds of billions of dollars. This is not an insignificant amount of U.S. taxpayer dollars. And so the last thing I'll say about this is two things. One is, and I like to use this word a lot, organizations that succeed are those that are seen as partners, and they're providing as a resource. If you just come in with an ask, got it, you want X or Y or Z, that's great. But if you're bringing material, if you're bringing literature, if you're bringing solutions to a member office to, by the way, make their boss look good, that now you're having the right sort of conversation. Now you are enlisting allies. You're building a relationship with an office instead of just doing something or asking for something because it is in your self-interest and maybe not so much in the members. And then, look, draft policy language that can actually get included. The most successful organizations don't just bring concerns, they bring solutions. And something that, we like to do here at Boundary Stone is we draw upon our administrative and legislative experiences. We've seen a lot of different iterations of ideas and legislative text and concepts. But because of arcane rules as it pertains to things the parliamentarian will or will not let you do, or which committee you have to have germaneness for or jurisdiction, there are rules to all of this. And so do your homework before you go in with that ask to, again, make the member and the committee staff that you're likely working with make their job that much easier by doing your homework on this, and don't ask them for something that they could never deliver on.
All very good advice. So we have a couple more questions for our panelists, but I want to get to our questions from the audience too. So Pete, I'm going to give you a quick one. How long is this process going to take? What do we think the timeline is going to be? You tell me what you think, and then I'll give you my thoughts on the other side, maybe.
Well, I have heard from every committee chair and ranking that they are going to pass this reauthorization on time, and so there's no reason to doubt that. Let's start with IIJA. The 5 years expires next September, the end of next September. So, that is the process we are around, is kind of working backwards from there as an ambitious thing. That being said, and I'll couch this thing. One, it is unlikely, it would be extraordinary to have a reauthorization done on time. It would be
very fair.
Yeah. Kind of like every year we're going to do a probe, so we're going to do all individual bills and we're going to pass it on time.
All 12 bills, they're going to be done by July.
Yes. The process, a best case scenario is it'll be done inside and implemented and started going into effect next September. I think that is unlikely. That being said, as we saw with IIJA, much of that bill was written in, actually not only, it was written in the Congress before, and the administration before. And so you don't even get to wait till the final Congress where you think it's going to act. So, I think we could be looking at maybe a year, but again, that's where I think the macro questions really come in. It comes into, do we have to pay for? Where do we have in terms of prioritization? What is going on with the economy? Is there a sudden urgency for actually we do want infrastructure and the like? And so that's the ballpark here. So
yeah, I think you're right on the money there. I've heard from the House T&I Republicans that their goal is really to have a bill that's like ready to be marked up before the end of this calendar year, so that they can be hitting the ground running in the second session early in the year to get the bill through the House. Because as we know, getting in this Congress, getting things through the House is probably harder than getting them through the Senate. So we got to get over that first hurdle. I certainly lived through it with FAA. It was way more challenging to get that through the House process because you do kind of have to, in these big bills where you've got some sort of, you got to do a little bipartisan work on the front end, you have to take a lot of amendments, and you've got to take a lot of votes on the floor, and you got to take a lot of choices that could maybe make this whole thing fall apart. So I think you're right that this is really the timeline to be thinking about.
But I'll add too, it doesn't just magically drop onto the floor. The committees are, and that's where what you're seeing with T&I and EPW, they've got to have, a draft bill that comes out that they're marking up, and then they're voting on it at the committee level. And so that, and then on the Senate side, EPW goes first, but then we're also waiting on Commerce, who does OST and some of the motor carrier and other port stuff, and then banking, who has the transit title. And so there are several processes that have to happen. And so again, when they all are, many of them are starting to work back from a next September. That's why it's not out of the question that we are actually trying to mark something up. That doesn't mean, again, the EPW had marked up and passed out of committee the bills in the Congress before. That's different than when is this bill when are we in the Rose Garden?
Yeah, totally. So I'm going to pull a question from our audience here because it lets me talk about permitting reform, which is my favorite topic. Have there been any conversations around the Army Corps of Engineers and the impact they often have on the delay of new projects? And I think this is a great sort of opening to how do we find some of this, again, some of this bipartisan momentum on how do we make it quicker to implement and get steel in the ground? Because that seems to be something that, in a time in DC where we disagree about everything, everybody agrees that's a challenge. So I will maybe I'll jump all this to Andrew Wishnia, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, I'll just provide a quick insight, which is, Emily, I think you're well aware of the fact that this is the grease that oftentimes gets transportation and infrastructure bills passed, are permitting reforms, for which there have been over 100 permitting reform provisions included in infrastructure bills just in the last 4 cycles alone. So that's how these bills get done, including the one federal decision title, which we talked about at the outset. And then you see the Trump administration, moving as a priority, as an administration priority, separate and apart from the bill implementation process. You saw the termination of NEPA regulations, and 85 federal agencies will then have to go through a process of writing their own NEPA implementing procedures. There's also some discussion within the U.S. Department of Transportation of sort of headquartering, for lack of a better word, NEPA decisions on environmental assessments and environmental impact statements to make sure that there's some consistency and coordination amongst the 52 division offices, the 50 state division offices, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. So permitting is absolutely a priority. And I think, you're seeing more and more discussion on a bipartisan basis about ways to expedite all types of projects, including clean energy projects, to make sure that they're delivered. We don't want to just talk about projects. We want to deliver projects. So I think permitting is absolutely going to be front and center yet again for another infrastructure bill. And there's, still a necessary and important conversation to have about how to move projects forward efficiently and effectively without undermining environmental protections.
Yeah, it feels like the wind has been at our back for permitting for quite some time. And I've told a lot of folks that, like, hey, look, we just got to survive the reconciliation process, and then we'll be back in a world where the people who want to build things are going to have to work together to pass laws. That's sort of where we go, and I'm hopeful that that'll get us back on track with the legislative permitting reform. Although I suspect the Trump administration will do quite a bit in the meantime. Another question from the chat we have: what conversations are being had around vehicle miles traveled or a road user charge program as it relates to transportation funding? This ties back a little bit to what Pete was covering in terms of the shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund. So maybe I'll kick this one to Pete, and then whoever else wants to jump in, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to hear one of the answers too. So yes, there have been conversations. Chairman Graves actually for a while had been one of the bigger advocates for transitioning to a mileage-based system. The problem continues to be that there is not a ready to deploy system at the federal level. Obviously, the other problem being finding a system that addresses the privacy concerns as well as the actual kind of collection, the rate that comes with that is, there are a lot of downfalls and shortfalls of the gas tax. One of them that it does not have is that it is really, really cheap to administer. It is really efficient. I think it's like 98 or whatever cents of the dollar actually get collected. And so I think there is, because of the kind of increased urgency and the all right, if we're really going to solve this, is a mileage-based system the answer? We've seen kind of Chairman Graves pull back a little, and it always, with any of this, there's always a sense that both parties want the other party to really lean in on it so that they can hammer them. It's kind of like again, solving the trust fund is actually not that hard. Raise the gas tax, and everyone would love the other party to do it. And so, so I think
live in that Spider-Man meme where everybody's pointing at each other like that.
Yeah. But and everyone just points out that we have not raised the gas tax and never says, so what are you proposing? And so it feels slightly like not an abandonment of it, but if people are being forced to what is the solution now, that there is a kind of a sense and a slight acknowledgement yet that there is not that solution. I think there was program in IIJA to kind of be doing these pilots and to really advance on that. And I don't know that we are necessarily 5 years further along in the process than we were at the last bill signing. And so I don't think we are abandoning it as something that is being pursued, but I don't know that we are at the point where that is actually something that is being implemented, especially nationally. I don't know, Andrew, if you have a thought.
The only thing I'll add is, a former boss of mine used to say, things are worth having or worth paying for. And so I do think that a key component of the next bill will be wrestling with this issue. I do think that part of the solve, in addition to some permitting reforms, and by the way, not just permitting reforms, but like process reforms. I just want to kind of broaden that term a little bit, because a lot of what I saw in the agency had nothing to do with any permits that were slowing things down. There were some process improvements that maybe will be part of the mix here. But yes, I agree that whether it's general fund transfers, whether it's road-based usage charges, whether it's VMT, whether it's excise tax, there's a ton of opportunity out there. And I think that some form of solution cobbling those together is going to need to be part of a long-term funding solution. Or we're kidding ourselves if we're thinking that things are worth having or worth paying for, or at least we're not practicing what we preach.
And one last thing I'll add in there too is there is a lot of talk of an EV fee or a kind of tax on EVs that is being discussed right now in the context of reconciliation. I think it makes it very difficult to actually, if that is actually passed in reconciliation, it makes it very difficult to really address the highway trust fund in reauthorization, because then what you're actually talking about is just, do we want to increase the fee on on gas cars? And I think that's always, it takes out some of the EVs paying into, if we have addressed that and kind of it provides some political cover to walk. But I do think that complicates the chances of a real solution.
So I'm going to ask a question from my own list. We obviously had Secretary Duffy testifying this morning, and one of the things he talked about was the program towards building EV charging stations. And he had a really interesting quote where he sort of talked about redoing the guidance and said, he says, quote, "You can have a debate about whether we should have charging stations or not, but you guys passed a bill with charging stations. I think if you pass a bill saying we should build out American infrastructure with charging stations, we should build charging stations." So I just kind of want to throw this up as is this an example of maybe a Trump administration philosophy on hey, look, not just the permitting, but the rulemaking process is too slow and takes too long. And if Congress authorizes money, well, hey, maybe we should figure out why it took so long to actually do something with. So maybe Andrew Rogers, this goes to you.
That's what I was thinking of without saying it as that prior question was being prompted. I mean, look, I think that it's easy to point fingers and second guess, and there's a tremendous amount of benefit of hindsight in standing up new programs, which a lot of these were a lot of new programs all at once to non-traditional recipients, which is maybe moving too much plumbing all at the same time to expect a different outcome. But you know what? We get a second crack at bats. We have an opportunity now to make improvements to the existing programs, and also to have lessons learned when we're reauthorizing the next time around. It's maybe a discretionary program should have been formalized, or maybe a formalized program should have been sub-allocated, or maybe insert other option here. The point is that we don't need to stay static in our thinking. And there is definitely some inward looking happening at the department right now about efficiencies, and I'll use that word earnestly, efficiencies that can be had in delivering some of these programs differently. I think there's another process going on that is maybe less efficient, that is trying to maybe weed out some policy priorities that are not aligned with this administration. But I take the secretary at face value. And when he says that, he used slightly colorful language, if Congress gives me a command and gives me direction to put charges in, it doesn't matter if I like them or not, I'm going to follow what Congress has ordered. And so, what he said today was he wants to do so, and he wants to do it more efficiently than the last administration did.
And do you think that framing, particularly in like the post-Chevron world, sort of puts the ball back in Congress's court that, hey, if you want something done and you're frustrated with how we did it, be more specific in your lawmaking so that, frankly, we can't make changes if an administration flip-flops and we have different priorities.
This is the Spider-Man meme. So I was in the Senate, I would point to the agency. I was at the agency, I'd point at Congress, and now I'm just going to point at both of them. But I think that's exactly right. I think that, be very specific. And specific doesn't have to mean do exactly this. It could also mean please don't do the following things.
Right.
and maybe that's more important right now as you're legislating, particularly when you're leaning into new areas. I'm thinking, Pete mentioned an AI title. I think that is the type of thing that is very likely to exist in the next reauth and probably in a number of different bills that will come together on a bipartisan basis. And it will be important that Congress is specific here. Or I can just tell you, the agency has spent a lot of time thinking about what AI means. And you kind of miss the moment when you're talking about innovation if you're spending a lot of time thinking about what innovation is. And
that
so I agree with you.
Exactly like how the government would do it.
Yes.
Okay, so another question from our chat as we're getting near the end of our time here. What's the sentiment around P3 opportunities in the new bill? Andrew, I think this might be you again.
Sure. So one of the, I hate to say it like this, hidden gems that exists at the Department of Transportation is this little thing that's called the Build America Bureau. And the whole point of the Bureau is to, through loan financing at rates you won't get anywhere else in town, build infrastructure and do so with the benefit of the private industry having a vested ownership interest in that. That is I'd say, criminally underutilized part of the Department of Transportation. There are tens of billions of dollars available, again, at sub-treasury rates to really enlist the P3 community as part of the bridge building and the infrastructure building community. I think that's when the next infrastructure week rolls around, I think coming up in May here, you're going to see more focus on enlisting the private sector to help the public sector cure some of its past ailings, but also to really enlist the private capital that's on the sidelines that can and should be put to higher and better use. And an entity like the Build America Bureau is a perfect example of government providing just enough encouragement and opportunity and then sort of getting out of the way and letting the private sector does what it does best.
It sounds very much like the kind of sort of populist tool that a Trump administration might want to take advantage of too.
I agree.
So looking ahead, sort of, as we close out here, maybe I'll give this one to Andrew Wishnia. If you can give organizations sort of one piece of advice for, navigating this process, thinking through some of these more challenging issues, and maintaining that bipartisan support for their proposals, what would that be going forward?
That's a really great question. Maybe to build off of, what Andrew was just talking about, I think one through line of our conversation today is the power of partnership. Regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, that's how you leverage transportation bills to their highest and best use, is by partnering with the private sector in the case of, implementing a transportation bill. And in terms of getting your priorities through Congress, it's probably not too dissimilar. As a committee staffer, it is much easier to take a provision that has been championed by numerous members of Congress than just one. And it's much easier also to take a provision that's been prioritized by numerous members rather than just one. You have to think about the fact that, the committee staff are humans just like you and I, and their job as entrusted, by their boss is to get a bill done. Eventually, if they're at the table to get a bill done. And there's so many constituent parts and so many opportunities for failure that they want to take the path of least resistance oftentimes and not take unnecessary risks. And one of the ways that you don't take unnecessary risks is ensure that at the very least your dais is on board with a proposal and is championing championing it ideally. So I think the power of partnership, of coordination, of ensuring that you have an advocate that's able to, build the case across, one dais and, ideally across parties on a bipartisan basis. That's, how many folks have been successful. And then the last thing I'll mention that Andrew mentioned is also to pre-butt the case, even to folks who may disagree with you, because oftentimes, just because somebody disagrees with you does not necessarily mean that a provision is not going to get in a transportation and infrastructure bill. It's a continuum. And so you just want to make sure that that agita is not severe enough to kick out a provision, but that there's enough room and space for a negotiation.
Awesome. So as we close, we're short on time here, but we've got one more question in the chat that I think I'll kind of use as my lightning round. You all are experienced staffers. You've worked on the Hill. You've worked in the administration. What are the types of data that you, as a committee staffer, were looking for from stakeholders to help you make the most informed decisions? We've all been there where we've gotten like some packet from somebody that went straight in the trash. How do we get stuff that's usable that we can actually execute on? And we'll do a little round robin. So I'll start with you, Pete, since you're off mute.
Sure. So I would say, looking at the question and the thing, if we're talking about a grant program there, oversubscription is very important. If you've got $1 billion grant program that they only gave out 500 million because they didn't even get that, you're going to lose a lot there. You're also going to want to show the kind of where and the benefits that have been deployed. So if it's a safety program, you want to show that not only projects are happening and that there's interest in it, but here highlighting some great case studies as to why this project was effective at the underlying benefit. And then I would say things like, this is an activity or something that is consistently underfunded or underinvested in, using the kind of broader formula programs as to why it needs a discretionary grant program. I'd say that's one that would be really helpful if you're talking about trying to defend an existing grant program.
Andrew Wishnia, you're up.
No, I think that's great advice. I don't know if I have much to add on top of what Pete said. I don't know, Andrew, if you have any additional thoughts.
I was just going to say outcomes. Bills and ideas and money is all nice, but if you're not actually solving a real world problem, get in line. And so it's really important that you can demonstrate proven efficacy. I think the question was really focused on data. Have data that will show, if we invest in this way, we will alleviate congestion, we will improve safety, we will reduce emission, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. And, come with a story, but also come with the math.
And go ahead, Pete.
The flip side too is, if it's a new concept or a new idea and you're trying to tell them why, you've got to really show the why this matters, why this is important. If you were, so in IIJA days, if we were talking about the need for something because of it's a climate outcome, you want to show this particular thing has this disproportionate emissions. Similarly on safety, you want to show that, yes, we all see this kind of 40 or 42,000 annual fatalities, but really high, honing down to it, it's like this program or this emphasis is about, say, rural roads and evening, and this is why this has as a disproportionate impact. And so how they can get more bang for the buck in addressing the most impactful cause behind the kind of top line theme that they're addressing, whether it's safety, whether it's climate, whether it's permitting.
Yeah, and for my sake, as a leadership staffer, I think you find that the most resilient programs are the ones that have regionally diverse support. So where it's possible, bring to those committee staff not just information of the case study and the place you like the best, but a story that tells you that you could have regional partners that come from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different rural or urban areas where it's possible, and really build your coalition that way. And truthfully, it's a good point to close on, because that's the kind of stuff that Boundary Stone does really well, and we can help you to build those regional partnerships. And we'd love to work with you if you're interested. closing us out. Obviously, again, timing is super critical, and we're looking at decisions that are happening in the immediate future. We would love to connect with the folks on this webinar and perhaps provide opportunity for us to support you in your efforts to reach the committee staff. Our information is available on this slide, and you're happy to reach out to us at any time. We'd love to come in and chat with you. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you soon in the future.
Thank you, everyone.